Hi there, I'm Larry Johnson. Welcome to Countercurrents. Today, I'm not going to be interviewing anyone other than myself. I wanted to talk about the root causes. Whenever you hear talks about possibility of negotiations to bring an end to the special military operation in Ukraine, those in the West call it the war, but Russia's position is whatever negotiations take place have to deal with the root causes of the conflict. And I don't think many people in the West really understand or appreciate what is meant by the root causes. And it's a very simple thing. It's the dealing with the expansion of NATO. Now, how do I know this? Well, all you have to do is go back and look at the draft treaty that Vladimir Putin presented to Joe Biden in December of 2021. The title was the Treaty Between the United States of America and the Russian Federation on Security Guarantees. This was a culmination. This treaty really was a culmination of the efforts that the United States, along with its European allies, had been undertaking to weaken, destroy, and threaten Russia. It really started in earnest in 1995 with the joint military exercises that were being carried out by NATO in conjunction with Ukraine. The fact that Russia had been repeatedly rebuffed in its efforts to join NATO and to seek an accommodation with the West, constantly rejected. If you go back and look at the news media coverage, actually, starting in 1999, 2000, when Vladimir Putin first took over, Putin enjoyed fairly positive coverage by the Western press in 2000, 2001, 2002. The press started turning negative on Putin in 2003 because of Russia's opposition to the war in Iraq, a principled opposition. And as we now know, with the benefit of hindsight, a war that was contrived, carried out under false pretenses, and was morally wrong. But because Russia stood up against that, all of a sudden Putin became an object of disdain. Now, let's also note that in 1999, the Second Chechen War started. It is my understanding, I can't show you a document to prove it, but that the West, particularly the CIA and British MI6, were instrumental in working with, supporting, and assisting the Islamic radicals that were at the heart of that uprising, that attack on Russia. And the fact that Putin was leading the war and fighting back against it was also became an object, ironically, that here was Washington leading a war on terrorism as a result of the attacks of 9/11, when in fact it was providing aid and assistance to some of the very people that carried out those attacks, or at least people who are ideologically in bed with people like bin Laden, that were carrying out attacks in Russia. You had the terrorist attack on a theater in 2002 that resulted in the death of many Russian citizens, in part because of the gas that was used by the counterterrorism forces to try to subdue the terrorists. And then in 2004, I believe, you had Beslan, the attack on a school. It killed well over 300 people. So throughout all of this period, you had these attempts to create disorder in Russia through terrorism. And then you had the expansion of NATO with an additional 8 states being added. And throughout this period, Russia's efforts to, was, you could say naively, thinking that it could find an accommodation with the West. So this treaty that Vladimir Putin presented to Joe Biden, the first aspect is that, hey, no further NATO expansion. They wanted Russia wanted the U.S. to commit to not enlarging NATO any further, which meant specifically no addition of Ukraine or Georgia. But they also wanted a ban on NATO military exercises in Ukraine and in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. They had just, in September of 2020, the Department of Defense had allowed a B-52 to be used in a military exercise in the Black Sea that had flown along the coast of Ukraine. Now, if you could imagine the reaction of the United States to a Russian bomber of that type flying along the coast of Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico, the United States would have seen that as a hostile action. Well, same for Russia. The second element in that treaty was insisting that there be no deployment of U.S. forces or weapons in Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania, as well as Ukraine, because Russia saw that as actions that were designed to attack Russia. There was no other threat there. Russia was not threatening to invade those countries. This essentially would have led to rolling back NATO, or at least the NATO infrastructure, to what it was in 1997. Note, in 1997, NATO began using a military base in western Ukraine called Yavoriv. And the Yavoriv base essentially became a de facto, let's call it sub-headquarters of NATO. And the fact that it was one of the first targets, actually, that Russia attacked early in the start of the special military operation in March of 2022. But the goal was to, shut those down, get out. The third aspect that was in the draft treaty was a mutual ban on intermediate range missiles. And this includes intermediate range ballistic missiles. The United States, under Donald Trump, walked away from that treaty. And so, as a consequence of that, and one of the reasons for that treaty early on was in response to concerns by the other Europeans in London, Paris, and Berlin, that back in the 70s, the Soviet Union did have intermediate range ballistic missiles that could easily reach various parts of Europe. And this was to put in that treaty that was signed, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement. But when Donald Trump walked away from that, it basically freed up Russia, who has now developed a missile, the Rejection missile, which falls into a category of an intermediate range. It's a hypersonic missile. It's not just ballistic, but it's hypersonic, which means it can be steered. And it can hit every single target in Europe, military or political. But here was Russia taking the lead, saying, hey, let's ban all these weapons. The fourth element was to limit military maneuvers and activities. And this included limits on heavy bombers and surface warship developments in and around Russia. Because you never know when an exercise could go from being an exercise to actually being the real world event. And note, as I commented earlier, that it was in September of 2020 that the B-52, which is designed to carry nuclear bombs to drop on Russia, was allowed to fly just off outside the territorial airspace of Russia. A very provocative action. The treaty also wanted to impose restrictions on nuclear weapons. In other words, each country would keep their own nuclear weapons in their own country and not allow them outside the territory. And it was specifically said neither side could deploy weapons outside its borders. Well, this is relevant in light of what happened about a week and a half ago, when the United States, who had withdrawn certain nuclear weapons from the United Kingdom, from Great Britain, redeployed those bombs. There's no other way for Russia to view this than that this is a preparation of the West to carry out a nuclear strike on Russia. It is preparing to attack and go to war with Russia. You have to interpret it that way. There's no other way to view it. Sixth element of that draft treaty, a mutual security pledge, meaning that each side would agree not to take any security measures that could undermine the core security interests of the other party. It was basically mutual respect. The treaty also called for establishing what are called consultation mechanisms, so ways to communicate, such as a hotline, making sure you got each other's phone numbers at a minimum. And finally, the last point, sort of a principle, wasn't an item to agree to necessarily, but it was to include a renewal or strengthening, it was to include a reaffirmation that the security of one state cannot come at the expense of the security of another. This is what Russia means by indivisible security. These 8 items were in that treaty that Vladimir Putin presented to Joe Biden. Now, what's interesting is Biden did not immediately reject it. In fact, gave a hint that, well, maybe this is something we can work with here. But it was only later in January when Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, speaking to then Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Blinken told him in no uncertain terms, basically, you can take that treaty and shove it up your ass. You're not going to tell us what we can deploy. You're not going to tell us where we can go. You're not going to tell us what we can do. You're not going to impose any restrictions on us. We're in charge. You're not. That was the message. That is the reason that the special military operation was launched. Because not just Vladimir Putin, but the general staff, foreign ministry, all they had to do was look back at the preceding 30 years. Well, at that point, let's call it 28 years, or, going back to 1995. So that period from 95 started the expansion of NATO and the deliberate incorporation of Ukraine as a de facto member of NATO. And what I mean by a de facto member of NATO is Ukraine, there are only 6 other members of NATO that hosted more NATO military exercises than Ukraine. Ukraine was one of the most active hosts for NATO military exercises, even though NATO had expanded to well over 28 countries. Number 2, it had a base at Yavoriv and other facilities in Ukraine. So apart from not having an Article 5 guarantee, and apart from not having to contribute a portion of its national budget to NATO, Ukraine was a de facto member of NATO. And NATO was the training that was underway was not just through NATO, but also through the U.S. European Command, U.S. EUCOM. And then you had the activities of the CIA. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the CIA moved back in a big way. And one of the activities that was uncovered was the construction of 30 biolabs throughout Ukraine, done under the auspices of DOD, but I believe the CIA was heavily involved with this. This was not coming up with medical treatments to improve veterinary health, the health of animals and livestock. This was research on biological weapons that would be used against Russia. The amount of documentation that was recovered was significant, and even Victoria Nuland didn't deny that this was the activity that was underway. So when you go back to looking at how does this war come to an end, the only way it's going to come to an end, I believe, is through military force. Russia's not just fighting Ukraine. They are fighting NATO. NATO must be defeated. NATO keeps insisting that it is a defensive organization. Yet, the exercises, military exercises they conducted in the Black Sea one of them consisted of U.S. Marines and landing craft landing on the shores of Ukraine. That is not a defensive action. That's an offensive action. This push by NATO right now, verbally, we're seeing countries such as the UK and Germany and France issue a variety of threats. And they continue to accuse Russia of the very thing that those NATO states are doing. It is the NATO states that have expanded to the east. It's not Russia that has expanded to the west. The war in Ukraine was provoked through a variety of both diplomatic snubs, military buildup, and rejection of diplomatic overtures, repeated overtures by the Russians, first under Boris Yeltsin, later under Vladimir Putin, and we saw it even in the provocation with respect to the war that took place in Georgia in 2008. Again, the Western narrative is that Russia caused this war, that Russia invaded, ignoring the fact that there had been Russian peacekeepers in place in Georgia since 1991. And they were there to separate the sides because there were ethnic differences between the Ossetia region was one. And the Georgian leader at the time was encouraged, if not outright directed, to launch an attack on Russia. And Russia quickly crushed that attack and retained control of those territories that were formerly part of Georgia. But that again is cited as Russian aggression. Meanwhile, while one of the criticisms that was also leveled at Vladimir Putin was his brutality in fighting the Chechen uprising. Yet this criticism is coming from the United States at the very time the United States is killing civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan in far larger numbers. So again, the hypocrisy of this just stinks. So what we see now is there a path to peace? I don't believe there is through negotiation. the type of negotiated settlement that's going to take place, the West is not yet willing to give. And I think it's only going to be after either a military clash in which the West is defeated or an economic collapse where the West can no longer afford this foolishness that the path to peace will finally become feasible. Until then, though, Russia's position about dealing with the root causes is very, very clear. It's NATO. NATO is the problem, and NATO needs to stop becoming the aggressor towards Russia. That's it, folks. That's my view. This is Countercurrents. I hope you enjoyed my rant, my remarks. Please hit the like and subscribe button. It does help grow the channel. And we are closing in on 60,000. 100,000 appears to be in sight. Share this with your friends and relatives or somebody who doesn't even understand the issue and wants some more information. The root causes of this war lie in NATO. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.